The gangplank creaked under my work boots as I hauled my duffel bag onto the Northern Star, trying not to look like the complete rookie I was. After 6 months of paperwork and background checks, I was finally here, about to start my first real sea voyage to the Bering Sea. The ship looked exactly like what I'd imagined. Rust-streaked gray hull, towering cargo cranes, and the smell of diesel fuel mixing with salt air. My journalism professors back in Boston would have a field day if they could see me now. Their golden boy, the one who'd graduated summa cum laude, choosing manual labor over graduate school. But I needed this. Something real. Something that would give me stories worth telling instead of the endless academic circles I'd been trapped in. "You must be Stephen," a woman's voice cut through my thoughts. I turned to see a compact blonde approaching, her ash-colored hair braided back and steel-blue eyes sizing me up. "I'm Holly Crane, deckhand. Kevin said you'd be joining us today." "That's me." I shifted my bag to shake her calloused hand, ready to learn the ropes, literally. She gave me a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We'll see how ready you are once we're out there." Something in her tone made me pause, but she was already walking away. "Margaret's got lunch ready in the galley. Better eat while you can." I followed Holly's directions below deck, navigating narrow corridors that smelled like industrial cleaner and old metal. The galley turned out to be a cramped but spotless kitchen where a woman with curly auburn hair was stirring something that actually smelled incredible. "You must be our new crew member." She turned from the stove with a warm smile, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "I'm Margaret Nelson. Welcome aboard the Northern Star." "Stephen Best." I liked her immediately. She had that maternal energy that made you want to sit down and tell her about your day. "Something smells amazing." "Just beef stew, nothing fancy." Margaret ladled a generous portion into a bowl and handed it to me. "You'll need to keep your strength up. These northern waters can be challenging." Before I could ask what she meant, a Latino guy about my age emerged from what looked like an engine room access, grease stains on his red flannel shirt and a wrench in his hand. "Fresh meat." He grinned and mock-whispered to Margaret, "Think this one will last longer than the last guy?" "Jet miles," Margaret said with fond exasperation. "Don't scare him off before we even leave port." "What happened to the last guy?" I asked, settling at the small table with my stew. Jet's grin faltered for just a second. "Oh, you know. Decided maritime life wasn't for him. Happens all the time." He turned to Margaret. "Got any coffee? The engine room's freezing today." Margaret poured him a mug, but I noticed she avoided eye contact. "The captain wants to see you once you're settled, Stephen. Cabin assignments and paperwork." I nodded, focused on the stew, which was genuinely excellent. But something felt off about their exchange. Jet's joke about the previous crew member hadn't sounded like a joke, and Margaret's nervousness seemed out of proportion for routine introductions. The next day and a half passed in a blur of learning ship protocols, safety procedures, and trying not to embarrass myself with basic seamanship. Holly turned out to be an excellent teacher, patient but demanding, showing me rope work and deck maintenance with the kind of precision that comes from years of experience. Jet kept the mood light with a steady stream of jokes, though I noticed his humor got more frantic whenever someone mentioned our destination. Margaret fed us like we were heading into a famine, pressing extra servings on everyone and constantly checking that we'd eaten enough. Captain Kevin Hunter remained mostly invisible until our second day out, when his voice crackled over the ship's intercom just after lunch. "All crew to the main deck. Time for the real briefing." I found the others already assembled near the cargo holds, the Seattle coastline now just a smudge behind us. Captain Hunter looked exactly like what central casting would order for a grizzled sea captain. Weathered face, thick gray beard, and eyes that had seen things. He carried a small stack of laminated cards. "Listen carefully," he said without preamble. "What I'm about to tell you might sound like nonsense to some of you." His gaze settled on me for a moment. "But these rules have kept crews alive for more years than you want to know. He handed each of us a card. I read mine, expecting standard safety protocols about rough weather or equipment failures. Instead, I found 6 numbered rules that made absolutely no sense. 1. If you see a crew member in 2 places at once, avoid both versions and report to the captain immediately. 2. When the ship's bell stops ringing during daylight hours, remain completely still until the captain gives all clear. 3. If you hear singing at night, go immediately to the captain's quarters regardless of the hour. 4. Never open your cabin door between midnight and dawn on the 9th night, no matter who asks. 5. If someone claims they don't remember conversations you just had with them, end the conversation immediately. 6. During the last 3 days of the voyage, sleep with your cabin lights on. I looked up from the card, certain this was some kind of initiation prank. Captain, what exactly are we supposed to be worried about? Pirates? Kevin's expression didn't change. Just follow the rules, Mr. Best. Don't try to rationalize them, don't try to improve them, and don't ignore them because they seem ridiculous. He looked at each of us in turn. Holly, Margaret, you know what happens when people get creative with these guidelines. Both women nodded solemnly. Holly's jaw was tight, and Margaret kept glancing toward the captain's quarters, like she expected something to emerge from it. What kind of cargo runs need rules like this? I pressed. Are we transporting something dangerous? In a manner of speaking. Kevin tucked his hands behind his back. The Bering Sea isn't like other waters, Mr. Best. Things happen out there that don't happen anywhere else. These rules exist because previous crews learned them the hard way. Jet cleared his throat. So, just to clarify, we're talking about actual supernatural stuff here? Like ghosts and demons and all that? I'm talking about survival, Kevin said flatly. Call it whatever you want, but follow the rules. He turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. We'll reach the deep waters in 6 days. Once we do, these rules become non-negotiable. Anyone who can't handle that should speak up now. Nobody spoke up, but I caught Holly and Margaret exchanging a look that seemed loaded with meaning. Jet was reading his card again, and I noticed his hands were shaking slightly. After Kevin disappeared back to his quarters, the 3 of them dispersed quickly. Holly to check rigging, Margaret to prep dinner, and Jet to whatever mechanical project was keeping him busy. I stood on deck alone, staring at the laminated card and trying to process what had just happened. Maritime superstitions. That's all this was. Sailors had always been prone to ghost stories and weird rituals. Kevin was probably just maintaining some old tradition, maybe something that helped keep crews focused and alert during long voyages. The specific nature of the rules was definitely creative, though. I had to give him credit for imagination. I tucked the card into my jacket pocket and went to find Holly. Whatever was going on, I was here for the experience, and experience meant learning from people who knew what they were doing. That evening, I was organizing my gear in my cabin when I heard voices in the corridor outside. Margaret and Holly, speaking quietly but urgently. "This voyage feels different," Margaret was saying. "More active. I can sense it already." "I know." Holly's voice was grim. "The signs are stronger than last time. We should have warned him more directly. Kevin won't allow it. You know his rules about preparation. Kevin's rules might get him killed." I pressed closer to my door, straining to hear. "At least Jet knows what to expect," Margaret continued. "Stephen's going in completely blind. Maybe that's better. Maybe knowing makes it worse." Their footsteps moved away down the corridor, leaving me staring at my cabin door and wondering what the hell I'd gotten myself into. Last time, stronger signs. These weren't people discussing maritime superstitions. They were talking about something they'd experienced before. I pulled out my journal and started writing, documenting everything I could remember from the day. Whatever was happening on the ship, I was going to figure it out. That's what journalists did. They found the truth behind the story. I just hoped I was prepared for whatever truth I was about to uncover. The sun was barely up when I started my first real watch shift. the deck still slick with morning dew, and the coffee Margaret had pressed into my hands doing most of the work keeping me upright. Kevin had assigned me cargo hold inspections, basically making sure nothing had shifted overnight and all the securing straps were still tight. Simple enough work, and it gave me time to think about yesterday's bizarre briefing. Those rules still felt like elaborate theater to me. 6 numbered guidelines for dealing with what exactly? Maritime folklore. I pulled the laminated card from my jacket pocket and read through them again, shaking my head. Professional sailors taking this stuff seriously seemed about as likely as my literature professors suddenly deciding to become truck drivers. I was checking the forward cargo hold when I spotted Jet through one of the portholes, hunched over some piece of deck equipment with his toolbox spread around him. He had on that same red flannel shirt and was doing something with a wrench that involved a lot of frustrated muttering. The guy seemed to approach mechanical problems like personal insults he needed to argue with. 20 minutes later, after finishing my checklist, I climbed back up to the main deck to grab some fresh air before writing up my report. I walked toward the bow, planning to check out the rigging Holly had been working on yesterday. Instead, I found Jet in the exact same spot where I'd seen him through the porthole, wearing the same red flannel, with his toolbox spread around him in an identical pattern. He was even holding the same wrench and muttering the same frustrated complaints. I stopped walking and just stared at him for a moment. The layout was so precisely the same that it felt like watching a video replay. "Morning, Jet," I called out. "You're up early." He looked up and gave me that easy grin. "Hey, Steven. Yeah, just got out here. This coupling's been giving me trouble. Figured I'd tackle it before it gets hot." "Just got out here?" I repeated. "What time did you wake up? Maybe 10 minutes ago? Why?" I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "What have you been doing this morning?" "This." He gestured at the equipment. "First time touching this thing today. Why? Did someone say something?" That was when I remembered the laminated card in my pocket. Rule number 1. If you see a crew member in 2 places at once, avoid both versions and report to the captain immediately. My rational brain started scrambling for explanations. Maybe I'd been mistaken about the timing. Maybe I'd seen someone else through the porthole. Or maybe Jet had been up here earlier and gone back below. But even as I thought it, I knew that wasn't right. The toolbox placement had been identical. The clothes, the posture, the specific piece of equipment, everything exactly the same. "You know what?" I said, taking a step back. "I just remembered I need to check something with Kevin." "Sure thing." Jet turned back to his work, apparently unbothered by my weird behavior. I walked away trying to look casual, but my hands were shaking slightly as I made my way to the captain's quarters. This was ridiculous. I was about to report what, exactly? That I'd seen the same person doing the same thing twice? Kevin was going to think I was either stupid or having some kind of breakdown, but the rules had been specific, and Kevin's tone yesterday had been dead serious about following them exactly. I knocked on his door, and his voice called for me to enter. Kevin was sitting at a small chart table with what looked like weather reports spread out in front of him, a cup of coffee steaming beside his elbow. "Steven." He looked up without seeming surprised to see me. "What can I do for you?" "I think I need to report something," I said, feeling ridiculous. "According to rule number 1. Kevin set down his pen and gave me his full attention. "Tell me exactly what you saw." So I did, describing the porthole incident, and then finding Jet in the same spot doing the same work. Kevin listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as if I was confirming something he'd expected. "What was Jet wearing in both instances?" he asked when I finished. "Red flannel shirt, same jeans, same boots." "How did he respond when you spoke to him the second time?" "Like he'd just woken up. Said it was his first time on deck today." Kevin stood up and walked to a small cabinet, pulling out what looked like a logbook. He flipped through several pages, running his finger down columns of handwritten notes. Which piece of equipment was he working on? Some kind of coupling near the forward winch. Kevin made a note in his book. Good. You followed the rule correctly. He closed the logbook and looked at me directly. For the rest of today, I want you to continue your normal duties, but don't be alone with Jet. If you need to work in the same area, make sure Holly or Margaret is present. Captain, what exactly am I supposed to think is happening here? You're supposed to think that the rules exist for good reasons, and that following them keeps people safe. Kevin returned to his chair. That's all you need to think about right now. I wanted to push for more explanation, but something about his tone suggested the conversation was over. Understood. One more thing, Stephen. Don't mention this to Jet directly. If he brings up your conversation this morning, just deflect. Back on deck, I tried to return to normal work, but everything felt different now. I found myself watching Jet whenever our paths crossed, looking for signs of whatever Kevin thought was wrong. The thing was, Jet seemed completely normal, joking around, fixing things, being his usual self. If anything, he seemed more relaxed than he had since I'd joined the crew. It was Holly who seemed tense. I caught her watching Jet with those sharp steel blue eyes, and when he walked past carrying some tools, she tracked his movement like she was expecting him to do something unpredictable. During lunch, Margaret served bowls of some kind of fish chowder to Holly, Kevin, and me. But when Jet sat down at the table, she just moved past him. "Hey, Margaret," he said. "What about me?" "Oh!" She turned back with an expression of genuine surprise. "I'm sorry, dear. You said you weren't hungry." Jet looked confused. "When did I say that?" "Just a few minutes ago, when you came through." Margaret's voice had gotten slightly higher, the way people sound when they're trying to convince themselves of something. "You said you'd eaten something earlier." "I definitely didn't eat anything earlier. And I didn't come through here until just now." An uncomfortable silence settled over the table. Margaret served Jet a bowl, but I noticed her hands were trembling slightly. Kevin ate methodically, apparently unbothered by the exchange. Holly kept glancing between Jet and Margaret like she was watching for something specific. "Maybe I misunderstood," Margaret said finally, but she wouldn't quite meet Jet's eyes. The rest of lunch passed with stilted conversation about weather and routine ship maintenance. But when Jet left to return to his engine work, I saw Holly lean close to Margaret and whisper something that made Margaret's face go pale. I only caught 2 words: starting again. That evening, I was in my cabin trying to write down everything that had happened when I heard voices in the corridor outside. Holly and Margaret again, speaking in those same urgent undertones. "It's definitely starting," Holly was saying. "The signs are the same as last time." "But it's early," Margaret replied. "We're still days from the deep waters." "Maybe the waters are coming to us." Their footsteps moved away, leaving me staring at my journal and wondering what the hell "last time" referred to. Whatever was happening on this ship, whatever those rules were really about, it wasn't maritime folklore. It was something real, something dangerous, and something my crewmates had dealt with before. I just wasn't sure I wanted to know what it was. 2 days later, I was up on deck checking rope tension when the world just stopped. Not literally stopped. The engines kept rumbling, waves kept hitting the hull, wind kept whipping across my face, but something fundamental had shifted. It took me a few seconds to realize what was missing. The ship's bell. For 3 days straight, that bell had chimed every hour on the hour with mechanical precision. I'd grown so used to it that I barely noticed anymore. Just another piece of the ship's rhythm. But now, when it should have been announcing noon, nothing. I looked around, expecting to see other crew members checking their watches or wondering about the malfunction. Instead, I found Holly frozen mid-motion about 20 feet away, a wrench halfway to her mouth where she'd been holding it between her teeth while working on some rigging. She wasn't moving at all, not even breathing as far as I could tell. From the galley below came the abrupt silence of Margaret's usual cooking sounds. No more stirring, no clatter of spoons against pots, Even Jet's welding work, which had been sparking and hissing from somewhere near the cargo holds, had gone quiet. Rule number 2 hit me like cold water. When the ship's bell stops ringing during daylight hours, remain completely still until the captain gives all clear. I stopped moving. Not gradually, not after thinking about it. I just locked every muscle and stood there like a statue, the rope still in my hands. My rational brain wanted to look around, to figure out what was happening, to do something. But the look on Holly's face before she'd frozen told me everything I needed to know. She'd heard that missing chime and reacted with the kind of instant practiced terror that comes from experience. So I stood there, barely breathing, while 20 minutes crawled by like hours. The shadows were wrong. That's what I noticed first, once I'd been standing still long enough to really observe. We had overcast skies, gray clouds filtering the light into that flat, even illumination you get on cloudy days. But shadows were moving across the deck anyway, dark shapes that shifted and flowed despite having nothing to cast them. Then came the footsteps. Measured, deliberate footsteps walking across the deck behind me. Not rushing, not sneaking, just someone walking with purpose from one end of the ship to the other. Except I could see Holly in front of me, still frozen with that wrench in her mouth. And the footsteps were coming from the wrong direction to be Jet or Margaret. The sound passed right behind me, close enough that I should have felt breath on my neck or caught a whiff of clothing. Nothing. Just those steady footsteps moving past and continuing toward the bow. My hands were cramping from gripping the rope so tightly, and my back ached from holding the same position. Sweat was running down my face despite the cool air, but I didn't move. Whatever had taught Holly and the others to freeze like this, I wasn't eager to learn about it firsthand. More footsteps, these coming from the opposite direction. Lighter steps, almost like someone running. They crossed the deck in a pattern that made no sense. Diagonal lines, circles, figure eights, like a child playing some elaborate game of hopscotch on metal decking. Kevin's voice finally crackled over the intercom. "All clear. Resume normal operations." Holly immediately spat out her wrench and went back to her rigging work like nothing had happened. From below, Margaret's cooking sounds resumed mid-stir. Jet's welding started up again with its familiar hiss and spark. Nobody looked at anyone else. Nobody asked if everyone was okay. They just went back to work. But I saw Holly's hands shaking as she tried to thread wire through an eye bolt. And when I walked past the galley porthole a few minutes later, Margaret was gripping the edge of her prep counter so hard her knuckles had gone white. I finished my deck maintenance in record time, needing to do something normal and productive to get my head straight. 20 minutes of standing perfectly still while invisible people walked around the deck. That wasn't maritime folklore. That was something else entirely. An hour later, I was helping Margaret organize supplies in the galley's storage area when I found the compartment. "These lower shelves are getting pretty cluttered," I said, moving boxes of canned goods to get at the back wall. "Want me to reorganize everything?" "That's very sweet of you, Stephen," Margaret replied from the stove where she was browning meat for dinner. "Just be careful not to—" My hand found a seam in what I'd thought was solid metal. A section of the back wall shifted when I pressed it, revealing a narrow space behind the shelving. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were 3 thick logbooks bound in cracked leather. "Margaret," I called, pulling out the first one. "What are these?" The sizzling from her pan stopped. When I looked over, Margaret was standing with her back to me, shoulders rigid. "What are what, dear?" I opened the first logbook. The pages were filled with handwritten entries in different people's handwriting, dated going back years. Ship positions, weather conditions, crew notes, standard maritime record keeping. But mixed in with the routine entries were things that made my skin crawl. Day 7. Bell silence lasted 35 minutes today. Jay Morrison reported seeing his dead brother working in engine room. Brother died, 1987. Day 9. Singing started at 11:47 p.m., lasted until dawn. Captain Murphy found crew member Hendricks trying to open cabin door during restricted hours. Hendricks claimed he needed to let them in. No memory of incident next morning. Day 12. S. Best reported strange dreams about ship's previous voyages. Dreams included details about crew members he's never met and cargo runs that occurred before his employment. Recommend psychological evaluation upon return to port. I stared at that last entry. S. Best. My name, written in careful block letters, dated 3 years ago. The entry was signed by someone called Captain Reynolds. Margaret. My voice came out hoarse. Margaret, what is this? What's what? She still hadn't turned around, but I could see her reflection in the porthole glass. Her face was pale. These logbooks, they have my name in them, from 3 years ago. I don't know what you're talking about. There's an entry here about me having dreams about previous voyages. Dreams about crew members I'd never met. I flipped through more pages, finding entry after entry describing supernatural incidents. Margaret, I've never been on this ship before last week. I've never met Captain Reynolds. But someone with my exact name was here 3 years ago, experiencing the same things we're experiencing now. Margaret finally turned around, and her kind brown eyes were filled with something that looked like panic. I've never seen those books before in my life, she said, but her nervous glance toward the hidden compartment told a different story. Maybe the previous cook left them there. The handwriting changes between entries. Multiple people wrote in these logs. I held up the book, pointing to the entry about my supposed dreams. Look at this date, 3 years ago. Look at the detailed descriptions of things that are happening right now. The bell stopping, the strange shadows, crew members seeing dead relatives. Stephen, I really don't know. Yesterday, when you said you thought I'd already eaten lunch, when I hadn't come through the galley yet. And this morning, when you looked surprised to see me at breakfast, even though we'd talked about me helping with supplies. I closed the logbook and looked at her directly. Margaret, do I remind you of someone? Her face crumpled slightly, and she turned back to her cooking with movements that seemed forced and mechanical. You're a very nice young man, Stephen. Sometimes you just remind me of someone I used to know. Someone named S. Best who was on this ship 3 years ago. I really need to focus on dinner preparations. I wrapped the logbooks back in their oiled cloth and returned them to the hidden compartment, but not before memorizing several more entries, including one that made my blood run cold. Day 10. Lost contact with S. Best during night singing incident. Found him on deck at dawn with no memory of leaving his cabin. Claims he spent entire night locked in his room, but door was found open and wet footprints led to his bunk. Recommend immediate medical evaluation and possible psychiatric hold upon return to port. Back in my cabin that evening, I wrote everything down in my journal, trying to make sense of what I'd discovered. Someone with my name, someone who sounded exactly like me, had been on this ship before, had experienced the same supernatural events, had even kept a journal, just like I was doing. But according to my own memories, my own life, I'd never set foot on a ship before last week. Either someone was playing an elaborate practical joke involving forged logbooks and planted evidence, or something was happening on this ship that defied every rational explanation I could think of. Given what I'd witnessed with Jet's duplication and today's 20-minute dance with invisible footsteps, I was starting to lean toward the latter. The question was, if I was somehow repeating someone else's experience, how did it end for the first Stephen Best? And did I really want to find out? I was still staring at my journal, trying to process what I'd found in those hidden logs, when the singing started. At first, I thought it was coming from someone's radio or maybe Margaret humming while she cleaned the galley. But as I listened, the sound grew clearer and more complex. Multiple voices weaving together in harmonies that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, like nothing I'd ever heard before, sung in a language that felt familiar even though I couldn't understand a single word. The voices rose and fell in patterns that made my chest tight with something between longing and fear. Part of me wanted to open my cabin door and follow the sound to its source, to see who was creating something so achingly lovely in the middle of the Bering Sea. Then I remembered Rule 3. If you hear singing during nighttime hours, report to the captain's quarters immediately. I grabbed my jacket and stepped into the corridor, expecting to find it empty. Instead, Holly was already there, moving toward Kevin's quarters with quick, purposeful steps. Her face looked pale in the dim lighting, and when she saw me, she just nodded grimly. "You hear it too?" I asked. Hard to miss. Her voice was tight. "Come on." We walked together toward Kevin's quarters, the singing seeming to follow us through the walls. Sometimes it sounded like it was coming from outside the ship, drifting across the water. Other times it felt like the voices were singing from inside the metal itself, vibrating through the hull and into our bones. Kevin's door was already open when we arrived. Margaret sat in one of his chairs, her back rigid and her hands folded tightly in her lap. Kevin stood over his chart table, studying what looked like navigation maps with an intensity that suggested he was trying to solve a puzzle rather than just checking our course. "Take a seat wherever you can find space," Kevin said without looking up. "We'll be here for a while." I found a spot on his small couch next to Holly. The singing continued, sometimes swelling so loud it seemed like the singers were standing right outside the portholes, other times fading to barely a whisper. Kevin never acknowledged it directly, but I watched his jaw clench every time the melody grew stronger. That's when I noticed his charts. Our current route was marked with red X's at regular intervals, and handwritten notes covered the margins in Kevin's neat script. I could only make out fragments from where I sat, but what I could see made my skin crawl. 3 lost here, 2019. Avoid all contact on 9th night. They know we're coming. Strongest pull at coordinates 58 to ground, 122 grau. The 4 of us sat in complete silence while the singing went on around us. Margaret hadn't said a word since we arrived, but I caught her mouthing along with the melody at one point, like she knew the words. Holly kept checking her watch and glancing at Kevin's charts, with the expression of someone calculating distances and timing. An hour passed, then 2. The singing never stopped, but it changed. Sometimes joyful, sometimes mournful, sometimes urgent, like a warning. During one particularly beautiful passage, I found myself leaning forward, wanting to get closer to the sound. Holly's hand shot out and grabbed my wrist, pulling me back. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't follow it." Around 11:30, the melody shifted to something that raised every hair on my arms. The voices became pleading, desperate, calling out in that unknown language with an intensity that felt like drowning. Margaret made a small sound in the back of her throat, and Kevin's pencil snapped in his grip. "How much longer?" Margaret asked quietly. "Soon," Kevin replied without looking up from his charts. The singing finally stopped just before midnight, cutting off so abruptly that the silence felt like a physical blow. Kevin set down his broken pencil and turned to face us for the first time since we'd arrived. "Tomorrow is the 8th day," he said, "which means the 9th night comes after that." I waited for him to explain what that meant, but he just studied our faces like he was measuring our reactions. "Captain," I said finally, "what happens on the 9th night?" Kevin walked to his porthole and stared out at the dark water. "That's when we find out whether we're strong enough to make it home." That's not really an answer. It's the only answer you're getting tonight. He turned back to us. "I need you all to understand something. Not everyone who's taken this route has come back, and the ones who did." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "They came back changed." Margaret shifted in her chair. "Kevin, maybe we should tell him." "Tell me what?" I looked between them. "Margaret, How many times have you made this trip?" She was quiet for so long I thought she wouldn't answer. Then, barely above a whisper, "This is my 4th time." I turned to Holly. "And you?" "3rd," she said, meeting my eyes directly. "3rd time through these waters. But you both act like you've never experienced any of this before. The rules, the strange events, you pretend to be just as confused as I am." Kevin returned to his chart table. "Because every time is different. The rules stay the same, but what we encounter." He traced one of the red X's with his finger. "It learns from us, gets stronger, gets smarter about how to reach us. What learns from us? You'll find out soon enough." Kevin began rolling up his charts. "For now, get some sleep. Tomorrow we start preparing for the 9th night, and I need everyone sharp." Holly and Margaret filed out, but I lingered in the doorway. "Kevin, those logs I found in the galley. There were entries about someone named S. Best from 3 years ago. Someone who sounds exactly like me." Kevin's hands stilled on his charts. "What about them?" "Did you know that person? The other Stephen Best?" "I've known a lot of people on these waters, son." Kevin looked at me then, and for a moment his weathered face seemed incredibly tired. "Go get some sleep, Stephen. Save your questions for after the 9th night." "Will I still be able to ask them after the 9th night?" "That," Kevin said, "depends entirely on you." Back in my cabin, I lay awake, listening to the ship's normal sounds. Engine humming, waves against the hull, metal creaking as we cut through the water. No more singing, no mysterious footsteps, no impossible duplications. Just a ship moving through dark water toward whatever waited for us in 2 days. But I couldn't shake the memory of that beautiful, terrible melody, or the way Margaret had seemed to know the words, or the desperate pleading in those unknown voices during the final hour. Most of all, I couldn't stop thinking about Kevin's charts and that notation, "They know we're coming." Who knew we were coming? And why did that feel less like a warning and more like a promise? I spent the last hour of daylight checking my cabin door 3 times, testing the deadbolt, making sure the porthole latch was secure. The metal felt solid under my fingers, but after everything I'd witnessed over the past week, solid didn't mean much anymore. Kevin had been clear during our final briefing. "Lock your door at sunset. Don't open it for anyone or anything until dawn. And whatever you hear during the night, remember that none of it is real." The way he'd said that last part, with his weathered hands gripping the edge of his chart table, told me he'd learned that lesson the hard way. 8:30 p.m. I turned off my overhead light and settled onto my bunk with my journal and a small flashlight. If this was going to be my last night of sanity, I wanted to document every minute of it. For the first hour, nothing happened. The ship moved through calm water with its usual creaks and engine hum. I could hear muffled sounds from other cabins. Holly's radio playing soft music, Margaret moving around in her galley quarters, Jet's occasional cough from the room next to mine. Normal human sounds that made me feel less alone. Then, around 9:40, the children started laughing. It came from somewhere below me, probably the cargo holds. High-pitched giggles and shrieks of delight, like kids playing tag in a playground. The sound echoed through the metal, in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint the exact location. I pressed my ear to the floor, trying to figure out how many voices I was hearing. At least 4, maybe 6, all young, all having the time of their lives in the bowels of a cargo ship in the middle of nowhere. The laughter went on for 20 minutes, sometimes fading to whispers, other times erupting into pure joy that made my chest ache with longing. I found myself smiling along with them, caught up in their infectious happiness, before remembering that there were no children on the ship. Around 10:15, the conversation started. Voices drifted through the walls from every direction, some speaking what sounded like Russian, others in languages I couldn't identify. The conversations were animated, urgent, like people catching up after years apart. I caught fragments that almost made sense, words that felt familiar even when I couldn't understand them. Someone was arguing in what might have been Norwegian. A woman was singing a lullaby in Spanish. An older man was telling a story in English with an accent I couldn't place. Something about fishing nets and storms and the importance of getting home before dark. The voices layered over each other until my cabin felt like the center of a crowded party where I was the only one who hadn't been invited. 11:30 brought the footsteps, not the measured walk of one person crossing the deck like I'd heard when the bell stopped ringing. This was dozens of people moving in patterns that defied logic, running in circles, dancing, marching in formation, climbing rigging that squealed under weight that shouldn't exist. The sounds crossed and recrossed above my head in rhythms too complex for 5 living people to create. I climbed onto my bunk and peered through the porthole, trying to see what was causing the noise. Figures moved across the deck in the moonlight. Some walked normally, others seemed to glide just above the metal surface. A few appeared solid enough to cast shadows, while others looked translucent, like I was seeing them through frosted glass. They were dressed in clothing from different eras, thick sweaters and rain gear, but also older styles that belonged in maritime museums. One figure walked directly through the forward mast like it wasn't there. Another bent down to examine rope work, its hands passing through the lines without disturbing them. A woman in a long coat stood at the ship's rail, pointing out at the water and speaking to someone I couldn't see. None of them looked up at my porthole. They moved through their activities with the focused intensity of people who had important work to finish. Midnight arrived with a sound like glass breaking. Not actual glass, more like the moment when silence shatters and lets something else pour through. The temperature in my cabin dropped so suddenly I could see my breath, and condensation began forming on the inside of my porthole. That's when someone tried my door. The handle turned slowly, quietly, like whoever was outside didn't want to wake me. When the deadbolt held, they tried again, applying more pressure. The metal groaned, but didn't give. "Stephen?" The voice outside was barely a whisper. I gripped my flashlight and didn't respond. "Stephen, I know you're awake. I can see your light under the door." The voice sounded exactly like mine. Not similar, exactly the same tone, the same slight Boston accent, even the same way I cleared my throat when I was nervous. I looked down at my hands holding the flashlight and fought the urge to answer myself. "Come on, Stephen, this is stupid. I need to show you something important." The handle turned again, more insistently this time. When it wouldn't budge, my own voice took on an edge of frustration. "Fine, be that way. But you're missing the best part." Footsteps moved away from my door, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. An hour later, Kevin's voice replaced mine outside my door. "Stephen, son, I need you to come out here. There's been an emergency." But something was wrong with Kevin's voice. He sounded younger, stronger, like he had 20 years ago, and he was using words Kevin would never use. Calling me son with an affection that felt forced, speaking with an urgency that didn't match his careful personality. "We need all hands on deck right now. Ship's taking on water in the forward hold." I knew it wasn't really Kevin. Our Kevin would have made an announcement over the intercom system, would have used his captain's voice to bark orders. This voice was too smooth, too concerned with convincing rather than commanding. "Stephen, this is a direct order. Open this door immediately." I pulled my blanket over my head and tried to block out the sound, but the fake Kevin kept talking for another hour, alternating between pleading and threatening, sometimes sounding exactly like our captain, and other times slipping into accents and speech patterns that belonged to different people entirely. Around 3 a.m., the ship lurched. Not the gentle roll of hitting a large wave, but a violent sideways jerk that threw me against my cabin wall hard enough to see stars. My water glass flew off the shelf and shattered on the floor. Books tumbled from their shelf. The ship groaned like it was being twisted by giant hands. I scrambled back to my porthole and looked out into chaos. Another ship had appeared alongside ours, close enough that I could see individual crew members moving across its deck. But everything about the vessel was wrong. Its masts were too tall, its hull too sleek for the rough design of working ships. The wood looked both ancient and somehow new, like it had been sailing for centuries without aging. The crew members moving across its deck didn't walk quite right. Their movements were too fluid, too coordinated, like they were all part of the same organism. When they turned their heads, their faces seemed to shift and blur, features rearranging themselves between 1 second and the next. One of them looked directly at my porthole. Its face was perfectly human and completely wrong at the same time. The features were symmetrical in a way that real faces never are, and its eyes reflected light like an animal's. When it smiled, showing teeth that were too white and too sharp, I saw that its mouth was moving like it was speaking, but no sound reached me through the glass. The thing raised one hand in what might have been a greeting or a threat, and I jerked back from the porthole so hard I fell off my bunk. When I looked again, the other ship was gone. The Northern Star settled back into its normal movement through calm water. The voices and footsteps stopped abruptly, like someone had turned off a radio. Even the temperature returned to normal, condensation disappearing from my porthole as if it had never been there. I checked my watch. 5:47 a.m., almost dawn. I sat on my bunk, shaking and writing in my journal until pale light began filtering through my porthole. At exactly 6 a.m., Kevin's real voice came over the intercom. Older, tired, but unmistakably genuine. All clear. Resume normal operations. I unlocked my door and stepped into the corridor on unsteady legs. Holly emerged from her cabin looking pale but alert. Margaret appeared from the galley area, moving slowly like she'd been awake all night. Jet's door stayed closed, but I could hear him moving around inside. Nobody asked how anyone else's night had been. Nobody mentioned the voices or the footsteps or the impossible ship that had appeared beside ours. We just gathered in the galley where Margaret silently served coffee and eggs, her hands steady despite the dark circles under her eyes. But when I looked out the porthole while eating breakfast, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Our wake stretched behind us in a perfectly straight line, showing our course through the night. But parallel to it, running alongside our path for several miles before veering away, was another wake, fresher than ours, cutting through the same water we'd just passed through, left by a ship that had sailed beside us and then vanished into empty ocean. I finished my breakfast in silence and went to write everything down, trying to make sense of a night that had tested every rational belief I'd ever held. Whatever we were really doing out here, whatever cargo we were actually carrying, the ninth night had given me a glimpse of the truth. And that truth was bigger and stranger and more terrifying than anything I'd imagined when I'd first stepped aboard the Northern Star. I stepped out of my cabin at sunrise to find I wasn't the only one who looked like I'd been hit by a truck. Holly leaned against the galley door with coffee in both hands, her hair escaping its braid in dark circles under her eyes. Margaret sat on a supply crate staring out at the water with the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen too much. Even Jet, when he finally emerged from his quarters 20 minutes later, moved like he wasn't entirely sure which body he was supposed to be occupying. Kevin appeared last, and the change in him hit me like a physical blow. The man who'd seemed weathered but strong just yesterday now looked like he'd aged 5 years overnight. His shoulders curved inward. His face had new lines I swear hadn't been there before. And when he walked, each step seemed to cost him effort. "Galley," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "All of us. Time for the real briefing." We gathered around Margaret's small table, the 5 of us crammed into a space meant for 3. Kevin set down a thermos of coffee and looked at each of us like he was seeing us for the first time. "Dutch Harbor's 12 hours out," he said, "which means this is my last chance to tell you what you've really been doing out here." I waited for him to continue, but he just sat there rubbing his temples like his head hurt. "Kevin," Holly said quietly, "you look terrible. Each trip takes more out of me. He looked up at her with eyes that seemed older than his 63 years. That's the price. The spirits drain life force from whoever's in charge, little bits at a time. Started noticing it about 5 years ago. Margaret reached across the table and touched his hand. You should have told us. Would it have changed anything? Would you have stopped coming if you knew it was killing me? The question hung in the air because we all knew the answer. Margaret's face crumpled slightly, and I saw Holly's jaw tighten. What spirits? I asked, though part of me already knew. Kevin pulled out a battered notebook and opened it to a page covered in names and dates. Lost souls. People who died in these waters over the past century. Fishing accidents, shipwrecks, storms. They get trapped here. Can't move on to whatever comes next. Our cargo runs are cover for the real work. Which is? We guide them home. Help them find passage to the other side. Kevin traced one of the names with his finger. The rules exist because these spirits can possess the living, especially during the 9th night when the barrier between worlds is thinnest. They're not evil, just desperate, lost. I thought about Jet's strange behavior over the past week, seeing him in 2 places at once, the way he'd seemed confused about his own actions. Jet was possessed. Briefly. It happens when someone's emotionally vulnerable, when they're carrying grief or guilt that resonates with the spirits. Kevin looked at Jet, who was staring into his coffee like it held answers. They're drawn to people who understand loss. My brother, Jet said without looking up. I keep hoping I'll see him out here, that maybe he's one of the lost ones. That's why you volunteered for these runs? He nodded. Margaret, too, and Holly. I turned to look at them, understanding finally clicking into place. You lost family in these waters. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. My husband and son. Fishing accident 5 years ago. My sister Emma, Holly added. She was with me on my first supernatural run. I made a mistake with the rules and she couldn't finish the sentence. That's why you both keep coming back. We help the lost souls find peace, Margaret said. And maybe someday, we'll help our own families do the same. Kevin closed his notebook and looked directly at me. The name in those logs you found, S-Best from 3 years ago, that was a different person who happened to share your name and background. The spirits often confuse the living with those they've lost. Similar names, similar appearances, similar stories. It makes them reach out, try to make contact. So I'm not going crazy. You're the sanest person on this ship, son. You've kept your head through things that have broken stronger people. Kevin's weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug. But now you know what we really do out here. Question is, do you want to keep doing it? What do you mean? I can't keep making these runs much longer. The aging effect is accelerating, and I need to start training someone to take over. He met my eyes. Holly and Margaret have the experience, but neither of them wants the responsibility. Jet's too emotionally fragile. That leaves you. I looked around the table at these people who'd become family over the past 10 days. Holly with her quiet strength and hidden guilt. Margaret with her fierce nurturing and desperate hope. Jet with his humor masking profound grief. Kevin with his 20 years of sacrifice, aging himself to help lost souls find peace. If I say yes, you'll learn everything. The real navigation, how to communicate with the spirits safely, the expanded rules for deeper waters, and you'll start aging with each trip, just like I have. And if I say no, you go back to your life in Boston, find a normal job, try to convince yourself this was all an elaborate dream. Kevin leaned forward. But you'll know the truth. You'll know there are people still out here doing this work, and you walked away. Through the galley porthole, I could see the distant outline of Dutch Harbor growing larger on the horizon. Normal world, normal life, normal problems that could be solved with logic and effort. everything I'd thought I wanted when I first stepped aboard the Northern Star. But I also saw the faces around this table, people who'd chosen to sacrifice their normal lives to help souls find peace, people who'd become my family through shared impossible experiences. How long do I have to decide? We dock in 10 hours, Kevin said. You can walk off this ship and never look back, or you can stay aboard for the return trip and start learning what it really means to guide the lost home. I thought about the children's laughter I'd heard through my cabin floor, the conversations in languages I didn't understand, the desperate pleading in those beautiful voices during the singing. Lost souls who'd been trapped in cold water for decades, maybe longer, waiting for someone to help them find their way. The spirits we helped this trip, where did they go? Home, Margaret said simply. Wherever that is for them. We don't ask questions about the destination, just help them find the door. Kevin stood up slowly, moving like his joints hurt. Think about it, Stephen. But remember, once you really understand what we do out here, once you see how much good we accomplish, it's hard to walk away. This work gets into your blood. As the others dispersed to their duties, I stayed in the galley, watching Dutch Harbor grow larger through the porthole. In 10 hours, I'd have to choose between the life I'd planned and a future I'd never imagined, between safety and purpose, between the known and the unknowable. But looking at the faces of my crewmates as they prepared for our return to port, I realized the choice had already been made. These people had become my family, and this impossible work had become my calling. I just needed 10 more hours to find the courage to admit it.